I'm going to start this on Facebook Live. Great. Well, welcome everyone. Esta noche hay interpretación en español. Si se gustaría, Imelda con Imelda. Imelda está aquí, ¿sí? Buenísima. Gracias, Imelda. Good evening, everyone. So glad you all are here. Welcome those of you watching on Facebook and seeing this at another time. We're so glad you're here with us. My name is Alex Shore. I'm the Executive Director of Catalyze SV, and we are in for a treat tonight. We've got some outstanding students and one of their amazing professors joining us to talk about a hot topic in California, in San Jose, across the country, which is how much parking do we need in our cities? And we're so grateful to have all of you here to have that conversation. You are welcome at any time to put questions you might have for the panelists in the chat function. So feel free to do that whenever you have a chance. We're going to go through a couple quick slides just to set the agenda for today. Again, if you si ustedes necesitan en español, hay interpretación allí. Wonderful. So, Disha, are we on to the next slide?
Yeah, sure. So first and foremost, do you want to go over a little bit about Catalyze SV?
Yeah.
And then we could do.
So this event is being brought to you by a couple of organizations we're going to highlight in a moment, as well as Catalyze SV. We are a community-based organization here in Silicon Valley. You can see who we are funded by, and this is our mission. It's all about creating sustainable, equitable, and vibrant places here in Silicon Valley. So feel free to check out our website. We'll have some ways at the end of the meeting where you can tap into what we're doing, and we'd love to talk to you a little bit more about that. So we'll share a little bit at the end, but tonight's really about Professor and his students. Go ahead, Disha.
Yeah, for sure. So we want to give a huge shout out to Mineta Transportation Institute and Transform. Thank you so much for sponsoring today's event. We really couldn't have done it without you. And we also want to thank our supporting sponsors. So SJSU's Institute for Metropolitan Studies, Santa Cruz, YIMBY, South Bay, YIMBY, and Cupertino for All. We really appreciate you promoting this event and getting the word out. Alex, back to you.
Yeah, could you jump back to that previous slide just for a minute? I just want to show Transform and
yeah, sure. Oh, did it?
Transportation Institute's slide just for another second.
Yeah, sorry about that. I think it just jumped.
It jumped, yeah. So thanks again, Mineta Transportation Institute and Transform. Thanks, Disha.
Mm-hmm.
We really appreciate your investment in the work. And so we've got some amazing panelists today. They're going to introduce themselves a little later by talking about their personal stories. In a moment, we're going to turn this over to Professor Gabbe. He's going to really be leading tonight's discussion and talking a little bit about his work first. He brought together some phenomenal students that we had a chance to visit with before tonight, and they're going to share their perspectives on what it's like to live in a city, what kind of city they want to see in the future, and how they think about transportation and parking specifically. So Alex, Morayo, Tommy, Claire, Bryn, thank you so much for being here. Can't wait to hear about your wisdom. And if anyone wants to connect with them afterwards, we're going to offer their contact information. They've been nice enough to share. If you want to hear more about their experiences, we would love to connect you. Next slide. So we do ask folks to stay muted. The crux of tonight's conversation will be getting to hear Professor Gabbe and the students. If you do have questions, put them in the chat function. That's always the best place. Professor Gabbe and Disha will be looking for those questions, and Professor Gabbe will be maybe answering some of those, hopefully. So if you have questions for him or the students, feel free. Try to keep things on track if you can. We're focused on transportation tonight. If there are other questions you want to ask about we're happy to see those in another way. That's part of why we give you the contact information in case you want to follow up with anyone. And again, we are recording tonight. It's live on Facebook Live right now, and we'll put it up on YouTube later so that you all can share it, and anyone who couldn't make it tonight can take a look as well. So next slide, if you may. We wanted to invite our teammate, Gavin Laurie, to just share a little bit of analysis we've done on the issue of parking. Part of Catalyze SV's work is about evaluating projects. And so Gavin has compiled some great research on the projects we've worked on here locally, and just wanted him to share a little bit about that research, so you had a little perspective on why we got involved in this and some of our experiences with parking.
Thanks, Alex, and definitely not as in-depth as the work that Professor Gabbe is doing. But yeah, we looked at the projects that we've been reviewing near kind of transit stations, major transit stations, and we found that of the 21 projects, the average parking ratio is 0.85, which is significantly lower than the baseline that most of the cities we operate in require. And so these projects got there in a number of ways. They use transportation demand management measures like providing transit passes or providing ample bike parking and other measures to kind of reduce the amount of parking that they had to provide. And so we found that there was significantly fewer spaces in the developments that had provided these alternative options for people, so they had other choices. We also found that affordable housing also provided significantly less parking than market rate housing, and this is to do with affordable housing doesn't usually have to provide as much parking, so they have leeway. And so really kind of the key finding when we looked at all of the data that we had compiled was that when allowed, many developers will reduce parking, especially when it's near transit. So we thought that was interesting to see when we looked at kind of the overview of all of our projects, that really there was this desire among many developers to build less parking than cities require. So we thought that was interesting and might be relevant to this. So thank you, Alex, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks, Gavin. So this part of why we're doing this event tonight, I mean, Professor Gabbe's work is phenomenal, and it's been something we wanted to share with Catalyze SV stakeholders for a long time. And we know it's really important right now because the San Jose City Council is considering changes to their policy around this. They held a study session on August 27th that we would encourage you to check out. The agenda is linked there, and Disha is going to copy that link and put it in the chat function if anyone wants to check it out. Some other folks sharing their perspective on parking, and the City Council asking some questions. We know coming up is a vote. Thanks, Disha, for copying that. Just a reminder, we see everything on your screen now. So the council is going to vote on this, it looks like in January. And so we just wanted the community and stakeholders to have some more information about these issues, to have more dialogue and discussion. But we also wanted to highlight the perspective of folks in our community, students in this case, young folks who are inheriting this Silicon Valley that we call home, and may have some different perspectives than some of us on parking, cars, transportation, sustainability, et cetera. So we wanted to bring them into the room with and highlight their voices with Professor Gabbe and have a little discussion and dialogue. So Professor Gabbe in a moment is going to start presenting his research, and then in dialogue with his students, ask questions about it. So we've got some questions that we think they're going to want to talk about. And again, if you have one or two that you want to throw out there, we'll see if we can create some time for them. Anything else, Disha, before we turn it over?
I don't think so. I think you covered it.
Okay, so we'll come back at 6:55 and just close things out with a couple last slides. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Professor Gabbe, the floor is yours. Thanks, CJ.
Great. Thanks, Alex, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate the interest in parking policy. It's not always easy to get a big crowd of interested folks to talk parking policy, on a Wednesday evening after work or school or a long day. So I really appreciate everyone showing up here and looking forward to the conversation that we're going to have. And I also want to just start by saying, this isn't exactly your traditional event format, and this really is by design because I think a lot of times from my experience, it's really easy to kind of jump into the weeds of like, what should the parking ratio be and all these different things. But I think backing up, because this is such a big long-term decision for cities that are trying to envision what are the next 50 years of these cities going to look like, and the next decades of development, that we wanted to step back and say, okay, we want to have the next generation in here to share some of their thoughts about what are their visions and experiences with other cities, what is on their mind in terms of ambitious yet practical types of approaches to creating a more sustainable transportation system, including parking policy. So this is really kind of the impetus behind the way we've designed this event. And, my hope is that this can feel kind of like a little bit of like a kitchen table conversation with me and our 5 students or recent graduates, chatting about issues around how we all get around, what we imagine cities could be like, what are the gaps between where we are today and where we could be in the future. So that's just a little bit of staging for where we're going to go. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I want to share a few slides just to warm us up a little bit to think about how parking matters for San Jose and why this is an important issue. And so this isn't going to be a super long presentation, but a chance for us to kind of get on the same page here. So why parking? I think the fact that so many of you are here today speaks to our growing understanding that parking is this issue that brings together land use and transportation and housing policy. It's kind of a common thread between our goals around environmental sustainability and equity and economic prosperity. And, it makes up a big part of our city. So, parking is something that is one of our dominant land uses, and certainly in much of urban California, we know that there's something like up to 15% of the land area of many cities, including in the South Bay, is covered by parking. So it's an important kind of interdisciplinary issue in planning, and it's also an important land use for us to be thinking about. And I love, if many of you or most of you have probably become familiar with Donald Shoup's work, but I love how he starts out parking in the city by talking about how parking brings up these kind of reptilian fight or flight types of responses. And it's, this very emotional issue for many people. I mean, maybe you can imagine a situation where, you felt emotional about parking in, the grocery store parking lot, or someone parking in front of your house, or maybe it's the opposite. You are frustrated with the high cost of free parking and how it's affecting people without cars. So there's so many different ways that we might be emotionally pulled into this topic. So I think it's a great one for us to sit and chat about with a basis in both data and our own experiences. So this is going to be a little warm-up question for us in terms of the chat, but we know parking is really expensive to build. So, and this is just the construction cost alone. This isn't even taking into account the cost to maintain or operate parking, or the opportunity cost of building this parking in lieu of building more housing or building open space, or whatever the case may be. So I want us to just take some guesses in the chat. Maybe just in a one line, how much do you think the typical construction cost for an underground parking space is? So like a space in an underground garage, and how much do you think it costs for a space in an above ground parking structure? So this would be like, if you drive into a parking structure at the mall or campus or something like that. So drop in your guesses, no wrong answers. This is just to get us thinking about it. So we'll give everyone a few seconds here in the chat to see what you think. Got a bunch of guesses coming in here. Everything from 30,000s to the 100,000s, 60, 85. Great, I love seeing this, yeah. Give everyone another 10 seconds or so if you want to take a guess. All right, well, what I love about these answers is those of you who are responding here are showing that you think that parking is expensive to build, and it really is. These are, I would say these ranges are on the low end and they're a few years old because it can be hard to get kind of area-wide data on this. But I would say 35 to 50,000 or more per space for underground, and it can be way more depending on some of the site conditions. $30,000 a space or more for above ground structured parking. The cost of building a surface parking space, is much less, of course, but it comes at a huge cost of devoting this land to parking rather than a more productive land use. So parking is expensive to build, and that's just in the moment of building it. Long term, it has a lot of other costs, and it tends to disproportionately affect low income households as well. So as Gavin alluded to in that introduction, we know that minimum parking requirements constrain new development, that developers in urban areas across the country would prefer to build less parking in many situations than the requirements allow them to do. And so we have evidence from major cities around the US, in Europe. We have pretty widespread evidence that parking is a binding constraint on new development. Some research that a couple collaborators and I did in Seattle, we found that after Seattle allowed reduced parking requirements or eliminated parking requirements in some areas, developers didn't build no parking, but they built a lot less parking. And that in total saved probably at least $500 million in construction costs alone, and led to 18,000 fewer spaces during a 5-year period. So pretty big tangible impact. And there's kind of this growing body of studies trying to get toward how do we quantify what happens after cities change regulations. Of course, Seattle focused on areas that were well served by transit, that were pretty walkable, bikeable, where it would be the most conducive to having a lower parked environment. So some other research from myself and from some other colleagues too has shown that parking leads to higher housing prices, whether we're looking in the Bay Area or LA. Greg Pierce's and my work looking at the national rental, urban rental housing market, we found that parking was associated with 17% higher rent, which in 2011 dollars was about $142 a month. And I think the more stunning thing was the hundreds of thousands of households that were carless, but living in units where they were essentially paying for garage parking that they probably didn't need or want, and probably would have rather paid less and used that monthly outlay for something else, whether it's food, schooling, all kinds of things that we're devoting money to parking for instead of something that that you might actually be wanting to spend money. And we also know that just having parking tends to induce vehicle ownership to some degree. So you can imagine that there are households that have 2 parking spaces. They're going to be a bit more likely to have 2 cars statistically than a household that has 1 space associated with their unit. And we know that the more parking that's available, the more driving people do. So parking is a driver of vehicle miles traveled too. And that's both of these papers are by Mike Manville, and really excellent papers, and I'm happy to share them with you all after this presentation. And one thing I also want to mention as we move toward our panel is parking requirements have been really static over time. So in a paper that I did with Mike Manville and Tanner Osman, we looked at the largest cities in Santa Clara County. And you can see that these parking requirements, we only were able to really get zoning codes and plans back to about 1970. But this is 50 years of stable parking policy, and a lot has changed in the world since then. And that's really locked in this set of auto-oriented and parking-oriented land uses. And so I think this is very exciting that cities like San Jose are considering reducing their parking requirements, because this is something that's probably time could have come a long time ago. And in this paper, we looked at some scenarios of how cities would have performed economically if they had changed their parking requirements in 2000, so 20 years ago. And we found that it would have enabled more job location and creation in the highest productivity zip codes in Santa Clara County. So we're trying to help tie some of these longstanding parking requirements with some of the economic outcomes here as well. So I think there's a real opportunity for right-sizing parking requirements. Depending on the area, that could be eliminating them or reducing them. They could be focused citywide, or it could be focused on neighborhoods with the opportunities for walking and biking and transit. And these types of parking reductions, parking requirement reductions, can be coupled with unbundling parking. So it suddenly allows, I don't have a car and I'm looking for an apartment, and I can choose in an a la carte fashion whether I want to rent a parking space with the apartment or not. And so it gives people more options, especially people without cars. And the city, something to think about is this tends to work best when cities actively manage their on-street parking too. So if you're going to reduce off-street parking requirements, it helps to start actively managing on-street parking with residential permit programs, pricing, that sort of thing. So it's two pieces of this puzzle that work together. So that's my little introductory spiel. And if you have questions about that, please do put them in the chat. I don't want to delay the conversation with these 5 wonderful panelists. So I will just kind of briefly introduce all of them just from kind of the order that I can see them on the screen. But we have Tommy, who is now a grad student at Santa Clara University and a graduate of our department, and is working on public health work here in the state. We have Claire, who is a 2020 graduate, and she is now doing environmental science in the Central Valley. And we have Alex, a really recent graduate, double major in environmental studies and communication, and he's headed to Japan in 2 weeks or a week or two to teach English. And then we have Mariah, who is a rising senior, double major in environmental studies and political science. And then we have Bryn, who's a recent graduate, and she was also, she and Alex were both in my senior capstone working with the city of San Jose, Climate Smart San Jose, and she is a future environmental leader as well. So we've got this great group of students, many of whom have environmental backgrounds and see their careers in some aspect of the environment. But I also, I think the perspectives that they're going to bring are the same as many in their generation too. And I've been very heartened by just the visions of the students I've met at Santa Clara and other institutions, and thinking about the degree to which, oftentimes it can feel a little bit dark about the future of the world. And this really, for me, often brings it back together in terms of you have this generation of folks who have a different vision and are willing and want to work to change things. So that's Alex and Disha, do you want to jump in and say anything else about that, or do you want us to just jump into it?
I think you're good. I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I'm good too.
Okay, great. Well, and then I would love if you all continue to ask questions in the chat. I'll try to monitor it as best as I can, but sometimes it's juggling a lot of things to be asking the questions and looking in the chat. So Disha or Alex might jump in occasionally to ask some questions as well too. So again, thank you all for coming. I just want to lead off with a first question for all 5 of the students who are recent grads. So just in kind of a nutshell, what's your vision for what a healthy and sustainable city looks like? Just kind of paint a picture, in a minute or 2 minutes. So we can go in whatever order. Some of the other questions we're going to be doing the hand raising tool, but this is just, I think, a good foundational one. So yeah, what does a sustainable city look like? And we'll start big picture here. I want to kick us off. Maybe Tommy, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I can go ahead and start. Hey, everyone. I'm Tommy. I think my ideal city would be one that has lots of greenery, first of all, and then also very walkable. It's one portion that I definitely would want is to have a good, solid transit to get around the city, good buses, good trains. But the primary focus being on the city being essentially walkable and having lots of greenery, lots of shade. So it's a very open city. Yeah, I'd like a city that's very inviting for people to hang out outside or to get around without having to drive everywhere, without having to go long distances to do things.
Thanks, Tommy. Yeah, maybe Mariah, do you want to share next?
Sure. Hi, I'm Mariah. I completely agree with Tommy on the greenery piece. I'm from Seattle and I took a urban planning class with Professor Gabbe last quarter where I did a research project on 15-minute cities, which basically puts essential services within 15 minutes of the city center, whether that's by walking, train, other forms of public transit. And I think that now coupled with just looking at public health in general is a really big one, and especially making sure that cities are equitable and we are putting vulnerable populations first when we're looking at how we want to redesign our cities and kind of thinking about that as we move forward. I think that is definitely what I picture when I think of a healthy city.
Thanks, Mariah. How about Claire?
Yeah, hi, I'm Claire. I kind of want to piggyback off of what Tommy and Mariah both talked about. I come from a restoration biology background. That's what I'm currently doing. So having green open spaces accessible is really important to me, and making sure that those are equitably distributed is something that I think I would really value in a city. I think that not only helps with, reaching climate goals or making cities more sustainable, but also has a lot of public health benefits for different people. I also think, having really good access to grocery stores or things that I need that's walkable is really enjoyable. I grew up in Santa Rosa, California, and there's a couple grocery stores where I live that I can walk to. Now I live in the Central Valley, and that the city I live in, Merced, is very spread out and it's really difficult to walk to different places. And that's something that I really miss compared to my hometown. So I'd really would enjoy having a walkable city or having lots of access to public transport, so I could rely on using my car less and be able to get outside and enjoy beautiful California.
Thanks, Claire. How about you, Bryn?
Hi, I'm Bryn. Yeah, when I think of a sustainable city, I think what comes to mind the most, as Claire, Mariah, and Thomas mentioned a little bit, is mostly like a high level of connectivity and also accessibility as it relates to both like food systems and transportation as well, like a connected multimodal transportation system that makes it easy to get places by walking and biking, not just using the car. Spaces for communities to gather for that fostered connectedness with each other. And yeah, I think that covers it, as well as green space. That's always nice.
Definitely. Yeah, last but not least, Alex, what about you?
Yeah, I'll definitely echo on what everyone else was saying. I was definitely going to speak about the concept of a 15-minute city as well. I think that's really a really important idea. I had to sum it up in one phrase. I think my perfect city would be a city built for people, not a city built for cars. And I think too often we have cities that feel like they're built for the automobile. And in a lot of cases, they were built to cater to the automobile or automobile transit. And I think kind of echoing on what everyone said before me, I think when I think about a city that's built for people, I think about spaces for people to hang out. I think about greenery integrated into the streets where you're feeling like you're not necessarily detached from nature, but finding ways that we can integrate green spaces and green infrastructure to our cities. And then also I think Bryn brought up a great food system. That, of course, isn't our exact topic today because we're focusing on transit, but I think that none of these things exist in a vacuum. When we're thinking about a perfect city, we have to think about equity, we have to think about the food system, we have to think about transport. And when we think about all of these things, I think we've seen some common themes looking at greenery, looking at walkable cities, and access to food and necessities within like about a 15-minute range of your house. I'd say that's pretty ideal for me.
It seems like there are a lot of common themes here in terms of green and the 15-minute city that's conducive to walking, biking, transit, the connection between food access and transportation. Kind of reminds me of in my urban planning course, this last spring, I kind of did an experiment to see, what if students created kind of a vision board of images around what their cities, what their kind of definition of a sustainable city would look like. And this was, at the end of the course after we had talked about land use and transportation and housing and all these different topics. And it was amazing how many of the images were, very green, lush, tree-lined streets, streetcars, light rail, bus rapid transit, people walking, people sitting outside eating. It was, it was really neat to see kind of the image version of what you five have been talking about here. I guess zooming in a little bit, all of you either live in the South Bay now or have recently lived there. And I always learn a lot from asking students about like, how do you get around Santa Clara and San Jose and the South Bay? And, how do you wish you could get around? So just kind of your experience. Wonder maybe if a couple of you would mind just sharing kind of like your own, how you get around, how you have, or in the recent past or currently getting around the South Bay, and, any disconnects there or connections there between what you think it could be like.
Yeah, I know for me personally, I had a car for the last 3 years of school, despite being from Colorado, and having to get it all the way out there. I find that the area right around it is pretty walkable. You can get to the store, you can get to classes, you can also bike to see friends. That's something we benefit from having a pretty small university. However, a car is definitely needed to get to any specialty supermarkets or get to any large green spaces, things like that. I found that it was a little bit tougher to bike. The infrastructure wasn't really quite there. And there's a lot of public transportation as well, but that was never something that was made super accessible to students.
Thanks, Bryn. Yeah, heard that from a number of folks in the past. Yeah, Mariah, go ahead.
Yeah, just to briefly add on to Bryn's point, I am a rising senior this year. So last year was my first year living off campus. So I had my car. And with the pandemic, there was a lot less of a need to travel anywhere. So we would walk a lot more, even to Safeway, which would be maybe a 10-minute drive. We'd turn it into like an afternoon walk. And so I think that's something that's kind of shifted for me, is I think there's a lot more encouragement to kind of make the longer trips and walk if you have the time. Obviously, as students, we have more time than someone that has a regular 9 to 5. But it will be interesting to see this year how that changes. And I know the Caltrain was a great option for longer trips to SF. We'd take that instead of driving and worrying about, are we going to have to pay to park? What are we going to do when we get to the city? How's that going to be? So there's lots of great options. And so it'll be interesting to see how that kind of all shakes out in the future.
Thanks, Brad. What both of you are describing reminds me of, there's this set of studies that have looked at the question of whether people who move to whether people walk more in walkable neighborhoods because of the built environment or because they kind of self-selected into it. And, I think most of the studies kind of come down somewhere in the middle. If we have a predisposition toward walking or biking or transit, we tend to prioritize that to some degree more in our decision. But also, if you have, like both of you have said, if you have these options to walk or bike somewhere more easily, you will tend to take it more than if you don't. If your nearest grocery store is, a 20 or 30-minute walk away, you're going to be much less likely to walk. So this really gets at kind of this important point about, the built environment helps shape our travel behavior, and also the lack of neighborhoods in many parts of the US, including the South Bay, that are, fairly compact and have the ability to get to necessary services within a short distance and are relatively affordable is, very small compared to the potential market for that. So I like to think of, us being kind of shaped by our environment, but also choosing an environment that we're going to be, comfortable in, and we're going to be able to use some of the transportation choices that we want to. I want to ask a few of the folks I know have some experiences traveling or living abroad or their hometowns, and just kind of thinking about, other experiences where you were elsewhere and had a different travel, kind of a set of travel options than you had, like say in Santa Clara, San Jose, when you were at SCU. So you want to share just some of your experiences out of the area, either in the US or internationally? Yeah, Claire, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, I have a lot of family in Germany, so I've been internationally to visit them a few times. I think what's really impressive to me about the structure there is all the cities are really walkable. That's a really big emphasis, and part of that to go off, what Alex mentioned earlier was those cities were built in a different time before cars, so that's part of it. But my aunts and my uncles and I would walk to get coffee, we'd walk to go get groceries, and it was all really close to the places where they lived in cities. I also think with that, I used a lot of train and like above ground and below ground transport when I was in cities. And part of that, I didn't have a car when I was traveling. So you kind of have to rethink, how am I going to get from A to B? And then you realize it was actually really convenient and really fast, and a really cool way to travel because you learn the culture of a space more. And I think, bringing that back to the States would be cool. I know there's a lot of, efforts in the Bay to improve rail transit and train transit. That's not as common up where I live in Santa Rosa or in Merced. But I think that would be a really cool addition, and that's something that I really enjoyed about being in Germany.
Quite a different transportation system than we have in much of the US. Yeah, thanks, Claire. Maybe Tommy and then Alex.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of play on, I have like the opposite experience of Claire. So I was born and raised in Hawaii, and specifically Maui has zero public transit, at least growing up. And like within my lifetime, the public bus routes were actually established. And I remember my mom works for the government, so I remember her like working on the policies and helping people establish the bus routes. And so it was a pretty, it's really interesting to see the differences, right? So Hawaii is very rural. It's a lot of spaces. It's really spaced out. So it's not walkable at all. And so even just coming to Santa Clara, which isn't that walkable, I still felt like, it's only like a mile away. It's only 2 miles away. Like that's walkable. But it's really interesting to see this dichotomy of like not being able to get to places due to development, right? And Hawaii is a great example of that. It's just because it was built to prioritize like really expensive, nice houses, it came at the cost of then being able to develop good transit for everyone.
Thanks, Tommy. Alex?
Yeah, kind of similar to what Claire was saying. I also had some time. I've also been able to spend some time in Europe throughout my life, and I actually studied abroad in Barcelona in 2019. And when I was there, I think in a lot of ways, like it was a lot of new experiences compared to what I was used to here in the United States, particularly with like going back to what we were talking about earlier, like being able to walk to a lot of different spaces of what you needed. I never needed anything outside of like my own legs to be able to get to all of my necessities. And then beyond that, there's also a great metro system in Barcelona as well. And Barcelona's have been taking initiatives to, it's a project that they have implemented to reclaim certain streets that were primarily auto oriented and shifting them into, like, maybe there's a channel for a car to move through, but most of the street parking has been removed and replaced by spaces for people to spend time with friends and family, and by green community gardens. And these are in the middle of what used to be intersections. And my neighborhood in Barcelona was one of the pilot neighborhoods for that. And so that project itself started, or eventually ended up influencing some of Bryn and I's work on our capstone, doing research, imagining what that would look like in San Jose. So I thought that that was definitely something interesting to think about.
Thanks, Alex. Bryn, go ahead.
Yeah, so I spent a fair bit of time living in both Copenhagen and Stockholm in the last couple of years. And both of those are very much bicycle-oriented cities. They're definitely built for that, and they've been built for that since, you know, they came to be. So I've always thought about that as kind of the dream, that even if something was 10 miles away, there would be a really easy, accessible, safe route for me to bike on to get there. And I always kind of felt like that wasn't necessarily going to ever be doable in the United States. But I lived in Seattle last month, and it was definitely very encouraging because there were safe bike routes and really great public transportation. So I think that really proves the fact that although we do kind of idealize these European cities as being like the best for public transportation and bicycle infrastructure, it's definitely possible to implement that here. And it might be a little bit different and it might be a little bit tougher, but people definitely are looking for that sort of transportation. And then just to mention something that Anne brought up in the chat, the fact that San Jose has the dedicated bike lanes, I think an important part is that level of like connectivity. Like even if there is a bike lane, if it's not connected to other bike lanes or paths, that's also an important thing to consider.
It seems like a really common thread through what all of you were just saying is that, you know, at some point, these cities that have very little parking in certain areas, that have very good transit access, they weren't always like that. It was a series of policy decisions that, you know, created the public bus route on Maui, that led to the greenery and block design in Barcelona, that led to the bike network in Copenhagen, that led to, you know, so really thinking about these as, you know, not things that are fixed in time forever, but really something that is changeable. And it does take time and it takes political will. Oftentimes, you know, there's a financial cost, but the reality is these are all very doable. And we've seen examples of this happening. There's a really kind of inspiring, I can't remember exactly the link, I can try to find it a little bit later, video about how Amsterdam went from kind of an auto-oriented city in the 60s and 70s, and then through a series of policy changes and investments in their bike infrastructure, really became one of the leading bike cities in the US. And, you know, also took what they were thinking of as a very parking-oriented development style, and, you know, now it's really shifted. Something I want to address, I've seen a few things in the chat, and just at least skimming, and hopefully I'm understanding. I think there are some really valid concerns raised in the chat about, you know, about equity and how do you change parking requirements in a way that that ensures that particularly lower income folks, or folks with disabilities, or seniors who are on a limited income, how different people who are using our city aren't left behind. And so something I mentioned a little bit in the presentation was the use of residential permits. And I think to the point about what happens in these neighborhoods, I think you can't eliminate parking requirements without having a good residential permit program in place. And I think there are models that can provide low-cost permits to low-income residents. And so kind of like we think about models of congestion pricing roads that can also involve some type of rebate to low-income drivers, or investments in transit alternatives to driving in the first place. I think we can think of parking in some of those same ways too. So, you know, I think the cities that are successfully reducing parking requirements, are also thinking about what happens in the neighborhood around, because you want to make sure that you're not putting an additional squeeze on low-income residents in the neighborhood. That said, I think something to think about here too is that most cities take a while to adjust when we change some of the development requirements. So, for example, we can change the height requirement in a neighborhood, and it's going to take years and years really for that to ripple through a lot of development. So, of course, this happens more quickly in some neighborhoods than others. But what we've seen, kind of our built environment now, which is the product of decades of auto-oriented policies, isn't really working either for a lot of low-income folks. So thinking about, okay, how can we make a shift and think of equity at the forefront? So I think those are some really valid concerns that you all are raising in the comments. And I think I would love to hear if you want to drop some of your ideas in there, ways to provide rebates or ways to help ensure that there are spaces for people with disabilities or different needs. Like, I'd love to hear your ideas here too, because I think these are certainly important equity issues there. I want to get back to another question for some of the students is, and I think Claire mentioned this recently, and I want to talk a little bit about it, is we've seen parking lots in a new light during the pandemic, and cities have taken different approaches to what is permitted and encouraged, both in on-street parking spaces and off-street parking spaces. Maybe do some of you want to talk about like what you've seen around in terms of during the pandemic, how parking's been used differently, or how you've used parking differently, how you've spent time in what was formerly a parking space, anything like that? Mariah? Yeah, Mariah, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a good example just even from this weekend. I live in Seattle, so I live in King County. And so the King County COVID testing sites are primarily located in parking lots now. So whether it's a building that's no longer in use, or some schools, when everyone was being schooled from home, they've used those parking lots as drive-through testing sites. And so that has been something really interesting and a really good use, especially even in my neighborhood. I live in an area where there's majority minority. And so that was one really big concern during COVID, was access to healthcare. And so now they've used the local high school as well as an emission testing site, those parking lots for COVID testing, and now vaccines. You can walk up and get a vaccine.
So using these parking lots for healthcare access, essential services. Yeah, that's a great example, Mariah. Claire, what about you?
Yeah, I have two recent examples as well. I think for me, both of my families come from a restaurant background, so that's something that I've thought about a lot during the pandemic, is how restaurants have been hard hit, and one of the downfalls of having such high parking requirements is restaurants aren't able, to seat as many people inside and outside. But now with COVID, I know in Santa Rosa and Merced, a lot of streets have actually been closed down in the downtown, and restaurants are able to actually expand their capacity. And for a long time, when people weren't able to eat inside, that was actually what really helped a lot of restaurants financially make it. And I think that was a really interesting use of the land space. And I think keeping those restaurants and allowing them to have that extra capacity can really help after taking such a big financial hit from COVID, and could be a really interesting improvement for the future. And then I also just signed up to work out at this local gym, and they're using the parking lot as space for people to work out, that so you're COVID safe, but you're also able to work out in a community and build that community. So I think those are two really interesting ways I've seen recently that parking lots have actually been used to help local small businesses, which I thought was really cool.
Thanks. Yeah, I've seen some of that as well, both in Portland and in the South Bay. I think to the degree that we're rethinking some of these spaces, like, we have this valuable on-street space that local businesses are, paying a fee, I think in many cities' cases, to use. and it's being filled with more active uses in a lot of cases. So one of the issues that we oftentimes talk about in parking policy is that we underprice the price of parking. We have this publicly owned resource that is basically being used for car storage for free, or for a very nominal amount. And so rethinking about like, okay, how does this space, maybe we can think about it in a positive way. Some of it may be parking down the road. Some of it may be curb access for deliveries, for drop-offs and pickups. Some of it may be converted into other kinds of spaces like you all are describing. There's not necessarily a one size fit all, but we do know that the way people are getting around is changing, whether it's the use of ride sharing, the use of bikes, increased interest in walking. And, so we know that people are getting around a little bit differently and thinking about parking in this kind of dynamic ways as well. So I want to ask, we oftentimes talk about kind of the high cost of free parking, and we talk about it a bit in my courses. I'm curious, maybe some of you might have something that really stuck out at you, or something after we had talked about kind of on-street or off-street parking policy that you looked at a little bit differently in your daily life. I'm curious if you can think of anything that you've thought about parking differently in your daily life in the South Bay. It's a little bit of a stumper, but yeah, Alex?
Yeah, I think that one thing, definitely starting in classes I've had with you, CJ, but then also thinking about the research that we've worked on together. I think one thing that definitely wasn't apparent to me before that I now think about every time I see a parking lot is issues like the urban heat island effect, and the way that these paved surfaces in our cities can actually trap heat and increase issues of extreme heat with negative health outcomes for folks living in cities. So that's something I think about, never think about, but I think about every time I see a parking lot now, is the effect it might have on excessively warming the city, especially during extreme heat events.
Yeah, that's something we haven't talked about too much today is some of the environmental costs of high parking requirements, and some of the ways that parking leads to an increased urban heat island effect, issues with water runoff. Yeah, so that's thanks for that reminder, Alex. Yeah, anything else that you've noticed? Or I kind of always start the class asking if you've ever complained about paying for parking, and people kind of laugh because probably most people have complained about paying for parking. Then we kind of think through, okay, what are the costs for parking? Is this a fair price, or what are some of the costs that are being passed on to everyone, whether you drive or not? So it's kind of an interesting way to think differently about something in our city. Yeah, Claire, go ahead.
Yeah, I think after learning that in your course, I don't think I ever really thought about parking lots like kind of as this space that sat and sometimes was really wasted until I took your course and I started driving around and I was like, this parking lot is like 20% full. That one's not like full, and maybe they're full like once a year, in malls when there's like Black Friday, or maybe once a month or something, a parking lot is full, but it's not full all the time. And that's kind of this space that really could be reclaimed and used in a different way. And I think before your course, I never thought about how empty parking lots are most of the time. And so I think that was a really interesting thing to drive around and see, and where I was living and realize that it was happening.
Oh, definitely. I mean, it's interesting to think about the way these parking standards evolved, and they really were diffused across cities, in cities across the country. We saw, cities erred on the side of too much parking. And we saw these high requirements that have stuck with us for all this time, has led to most parking lots are empty most of the time. And, we've really designed cities for the times, when, the day before Christmas or whatever the times are people buy the most, or if every single person is home at the same time and everyone has a guest, but really we haven't thought about cities for what if half the residents get around by transit, or what if a lot of the residents are biking or walking more, sharing a car, those sorts of things, or just want to pay a la carte. And so thinking about these requirements is something that aren't stuck in stone, but it's something that we can have control over. And I think one of the things that when we were thinking about this event that really came to me is it's easy to start talking about parking, but I think it's more productive in some ways to kind of back into the parking conversation and say, okay, what are the cities that we really want to emulate or aspire to be like? Okay, what is parking like in those cities? And kind of work our way into it that way, rather than kind of saying, for San Jose today, what's the right parking requirement? Because this is something that will shape the city, and will shape, shape development over the next decades. So one of the interesting conclusions that we had from our research looking at economic development in Santa Clara County and parking requirements was that, the best time to change parking requirements was, yesterday or 20 years ago. And even, some of the scenarios that would have had the biggest effect would have taken 40 years of development to really see a huge change in the built environment. So we're really kind of making investments for, for 20, 40 years down the road. So that's the way I like to think of this, is starting by thinking kind of big picture and then figuring out, okay, knowing that cities take a while to adjust, what's the parking requirement that would be suitable for that? And I think that's why we wanted to really lead off with kind of this bigger picture vision for folks who are going to be in this area for decades and decades here too, just starting off their careers here too. So yeah, maybe, I don't know if maybe Disha or Alex, you want to help me? You've been looking at the chat more, maybe an audience question. Do you have an audience question maybe for the panel?
I think Disha's got a couple.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Jeff pointed out that it might be a good idea to really enumerate the true cost of quote unquote free parking. So if you could go a little bit more into detail about that, just to make it crystal clear.
Sure, definitely. So, so the idea behind the high cost of free parking is that the parking that we have in our cities came with a construction cost and also has some kind of opportunity cost. It could have done something else with that space too. And those costs, are borne by the people who, when we don't have an option for parking, those costs are borne by the people who, rent an apartment, who have 2 spaces, whether they want it or not, or you go to a grocery store that has a huge parking lot. There's a smidgen of that cost that's spread in the price of every good. The idea really is that the cost of parking is just spread across society, whether you're using that parking or not. And so in a small way, we want to think about, how could we shift that so that, if you're using the parking, great, you can pay for it. If you're not using the parking, great, you have the option to forego that cost, whether it's in your rent or, maybe the price of something is just a little bit less, but you are, have an option there. So the idea really is that the cost kind of gets spread out in society. That's kind of the way I would describe it. And, in terms of our research around rents, you can imagine 15 or 20% maybe of the typical rent in major cities that we found, is really the price of that parking that's in your monthly rent. So varies a little bit by city and maybe higher in places like the Bay Area. But that's kind of the implicit cost that you're paying for parking. So there's I just saw a question come into the chat about what I think about eliminating versus reducing. I think the long-term goal from my perspective, not speaking to San Jose specifically, but I think for most cities that have an urban future in there down the road, I think eliminating off-street parking requirements is where you're getting. I think cities get there in different ways. Some cities get there by, first starting in focus areas and reducing requirements. More and more cities, though, are going straight to eliminating the requirements. And I think that's, taking steps from going like really slowly, incrementally to the end goal. I think that's probably working out pretty well because of this adjustment time. So some cities I know that have done this recently includes cities ranging from, Buffalo to Minneapolis to Portland to San Francisco. There's kind of this progression of cities that are kind of taking the big step of eliminating parking requirements. That said, like cities like Seattle, I think have been really successful in that they've eliminated the parking requirements in the downtown, major transit areas, and then places that are a little bit less transit oriented. They have had, I believe, half a space per unit requirement, and then the really auto-oriented places, they've kept it at one. One is still pretty low for a lot of areas in the South Bay too. That's when I showed that chart of what most cities require in a 2-bedroom unit, one would be, one was what we model in our paper. So yeah, I think there are different ways to get there, but I think the ultimate goal is, moving towards cities eliminating their parking requirements. All right. I'm going to ask another question to our students from some of the things that we were thinking about earlier. I think, like I mentioned earlier, oftentimes parking and I think other aspects of transportation, bring out kind of some of our fears and hopes and dreams. What do you worry about in terms of transportation, or your options, or like what's on your mind in terms of kind of your fears about transportation and parking? I know it's a little bit of a dark question, but see what you come up with here. Yeah, Alex, go ahead.
Well, I know Bryn and I before have talked about safety with regards to using bikes to get around in San Jose. And I think that that's probably a thing on just thinking about folks that I'm friends with, folks in my circle, other students. I think that that's a common fear that a lot of people have. I'm interested to hear what Bryn has to say on this topic as well. But I think that it feels quite dangerous to bike in a lot of places around the Bay Area. And I think that that's probably a fear and also a barrier to biking in a lot of ways.
So safety, definitely. That's I think a big one we hear a lot. Yeah, Bryn, what do you think?
Yeah, to second what Alex says, I definitely, I'm a big cyclist, so I worry that it won't be safe to bike, or that, single occupancy vehicles will be prioritized in city planning moving forward, and there won't be more and more bicycle and walking infrastructure. But then on the other side of that, I also worry that, some of these more sustainable transportation policies, and those might have some unexpected or expected consequences, and the burden of that won't be shared equally among community members.
Yeah, definitely the kind of safety and equity issues there too. Yeah, that's something that I've really worried about. And I know a lot of the folks who are here tonight, I can tell from just skimming through the chat in terms of your concerns too. What about Disha? Do you have a question from the audience that maybe we could pull up? Or Alex?
Wanted to check back in, if it's okay, Disha and CJ, on the overflow question. Are you able to do building in other ways that can address that, or in other places that can offset that? Is that something you can touch base on, CJ?
Yeah, in terms of if you build a bunch of new development.
Yeah, there was a question.
Oh, go ahead, Disha. think she might be frozen.
You might be frozen. Yeah, go ahead.
So, I think a few things that I would just comment in terms of overflow is there will be some overflow, but the city has the ability to manage it through pricing the parking and through using transportation demand management strategies to try to, not only reduce parking, but trying to help nudge and provide incentives for folks to use other options other than driving. So that would be, transit, biking. An example I can think of when I lived in Portland, when the city instituted a parking permit program, they also had a set of transit passes, a year-long membership to the city's bike share. This was kind of all part of this like helper packet if you forewent on-street parking permit. So the idea is that there are kind of some carrots and sticks that the cities can use. It's going to change. I think that's what all of these cities have found. There will be changes, but it's manageable. It can be manageable changes. And the cities that are doing it successfully are thinking, okay, how do we help encourage people and incentivize people to use other transportation modes? How do we charge a fair price for the parking that's on the street? And how do we help folks who are lower income, find a rebate or find some way to get around any high cost for them? So thinking in those terms, but I think that that's kind of would be my formula for thinking about this. But I think not pretending like there won't be changes. There will be changes, but they're kind of manageable changes.
Thanks, CJ. Yeah, I was at the San Jose City Council study session on this on October 27th or 28th. It was really fascinating to learn about that and learn about how, part of the reason we have a housing crisis is because we have so many folks who have to share single family homes, and that creates a lot of cars in neighborhoods. And if we built more housing, we might not have so much overflow parking in single family neighborhoods. So that was illuminating point that the city staff brought up that I found really fascinating.
Definitely. I'm going to take another question for the chat, from the chat. There's a few folks have mentioned safety issues. I think one of the things that we've seen that has helped with safety are cities that create protected bike lanes. So having some kind of physical barrier between vehicles and people biking. This is particularly in terms of bike safety, and thinking about ways that you can slow people down. So, I think a lot of cities are embracing this kind of like 20 is plenty standard in residential neighborhoods. So 20 miles an hour being the standard or slower, thinking about, we know that one of the issues in terms of safety and crashes is the speed people are going. So I think, gently slowing people down and giving people separated areas from cars and bike pads and transit stops. I think those are some of the ways that a lot of cities are really thinking about. How do you reduce the number of crashes? How do you reduce the number of people being hit on their bikes, that sort of thing. Go into the chat here and find another question. There's looks like there's a question. There are a few questions about kind of the future role of the car. And one thing, and I'll pose this to all the students as well. One thing I think that we could talk about is, what do you see the South Bay? What do you think is a feasible South Bay vision? You talked about kind of your big picture vision for sustainable cities. What do you think in your next 20 years you imagine this could be like? I think we're at kind of a turning point, and there's kind of an opportunity here to certainly not eliminate the car. I think that's pretty unrealistic, but really kind of like think about car light options as being something that's really supported, and knowing that those, if we can get toward a car light option style of city, we really will, be able to achieve our greenhouse gas reduction goals. We're going to reduce the amount of land use devoted to parking. So yeah, I'm curious to hear, because one of the things that I think the students have really struck me by is they have a lot of pragmatic solutions. I might kind of come at it from a planner, a planning perspective, and a lot of times they'll say, well, what about this? And so yeah, I might throw out there to the students, what do you think is kind of your vision in the next 20 years for our area here in the South Bay? What do you think the car could be like here? What do you think could be the balance that we're striking? And what do you think parking is going to be like, knowing that parking is pretty much free and in most places pretty ample here today? Yeah, Tom.
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly touch on this. So I think in order to solve the issue of the car and understand the place of the automobile in the future of the Bay Area, I think first we need to really invest and see the future of transit. So I think that they definitely have a correlated relationship. And in my own hopes, I'm hoping that given a greater investment into transit, right, I think that chat and a lot of us have this reoccurring theme of the importance of transit in terms of lowering parking rates and as well as promoting people getting around without needing to rely on cars. I think along those lines too, a big thing that comes up is safety in transit. And I think that one thing that would hopefully come apart with, improve with the investment of transit is that transit itself could be safer, and that would incentivize more people to use it, and therefore less people would use cars. I think ideally the situation that we'd have with the automobile would be an automobile light situation where we could disincentivize people to use cars by inventing new benefits or incentives for transit use. I think a lot of different jobs, a lot of different opportunities and employment could really double down on having people use more rideshare applications or more transit-based means of getting around.
Thanks, Tommy. Yeah, any of the others of you have some ideas, or what do you think?
I have a quick kind of related to your question, CJ. What do you say to the people who, say that, we shouldn't even be talking about parking until transit is improved? How do you respond to them, and how do you move the conversation forward from there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's certainly, some chicken and egg element here. I think the advice I would give to cities is we need to work on both at the same time. We need to be improving transit service. We need to be improving the experience and safety of people walking and biking at the same time that we're changing parking requirements. So, we're kind of having to do three things at once, but the reason to do that is because long-term neighborhood with little parking supply but no transit probably isn't really going to work. So thinking about, you really need to be doing all of this in parallel. Some cities though, that have good transit in some areas but have had high parking requirements in those areas historically, that's kind of the low-hanging fruit for them, is to say, okay, well, we have the underlying infrastructure in place. Most cities don't have that in most areas. And so I think they're doing the hard work of saying, okay, we've really got to shift the system that has gotten pretty ingrained. And if you can't do both at the same time, it's going to be hard to make it work. That said, all of these things take a while to adjust. So, even in an environment where you eliminate parking requirements for residential development, across the board, cities that are doing it, for many years, most developments are still going to have parking because they were built in prior times. And that's why, our research showed that it takes, decades and decades for the built environment to really change in a transformative way. So that's, I think the reason to get started now in places that are, that are most auto-oriented, because you want to start moving the needle now. And that gives you time to also do the transit side, to do the ped bike side, all of that. So that would be my kind of strategic approach to. And I mean, I guess maybe something in terms of, just to be a little more specific, is when I say right sizing parking, I also think, something that I want to emphasize from what we saw in Seattle is, many developers built no parking, but a lot of developers just built less parking. And I think that's actually getting us toward where, our climate goals or equity goals too, because that's creating options for folks who don't have cars. That's going to be conducive to, a more, mixed transportation option type of environment. So yeah, I mean, we can definitely think about this as something that is going to take time, but the way that we do it is going to be kind of locally dependent on what we think is going to be most successful here. Any other of the we're kind of running into our last few minutes. Maybe just everyone. Well, let me first. We wanted to have one more audience participation in the chat, and we're going to do this as a quick chat waterfall. And so what that means basically is that you can open your chat and type in what you want to say here, but don't press enter until we say the word. So it's going to be kind of flow down. Everyone's things will flow down. So what I'm going to ask everyone to include in the chat is just, what is one thing you learned or have thought about differently since this conversation? I'm sure that many of you, we have 60 some people in this room. We have lots of different opinions and experiences. What's one thing that you've learned or thought about differently, just in a sentence or under? And then I'm going to, after this, give all the students a chance to kind of give some final thoughts or, their main takeaways, and then we'll transition to Alex and Disha and wrap this up. So what's one thing you thought differently? Type it in the chat, but don't press enter yet. We'll do it here in a minute or 30 seconds or something. All right, we'll give you like 10 more seconds, and then we'll do our Zoom waterfall here. All right, everybody press enter now. Okay, so just skimming through this a little bit, it seems like some folks have mentioned things about street design, some of the costs of parking, some of our understanding of free parking, our the importance of expanding the tent and talking about these issues and thinking about people who might be more vulnerable. Yeah, these are all some of the topics that we wanted to highlight here. I want to give all the students a chance to just kind of say some last words. What are you, either maybe what are you thinking about working on in these regards in the coming years, or just one thing you hope that decision makers in this area take into consideration about transportation here in the future. So something you want to work on, or something you're hoping policymakers will take into consideration. You want to raise your hands, or I could just pick an order. Maybe I'll pick. How about Mariah? Do you want to kick us off maybe?
Sure. I think for me, the biggest takeaway is just since I've started thinking about parking, it's become less of making it harder for people to use a car, but making that not the automatic option you go to, and having like a sustainable public transit system where people want to walk and they want to bike, and that's easy and it's safe and it's enjoyable. So it's less of a chore and just a switch in mindset. Because I know for me, that's been the biggest thing that's helped me kind of transition to more walking, more biking, more sharing a car, is just thinking about it differently. And it kind of takes the stress out of like arguing about it, and more just coming together and saying like, we want a better future for our children, for our families, and thinking about it in that way and making it less of a battle maybe.
That's great. Thank you, Mariah. How about Claire?
Yeah, to build off Mariah, I think for me personally, just making that switch, I think in mindset when I'm thinking, oh, I need to go to the grocery store, thinking, can I walk there? Is that possible? And then, really going through with that action to, kind of practice what I preach is important because I do think having sustainable transit, having walkable cities are important, and I do have access to some of that. So that's something that I'd like to work on, and not automatically jumping in my car and trying to get my family to go bike to the grocery store with me or walk with me. I also think, through this discussion, I really appreciated all the comments in the chat because it made me think about perspectives I have not thought about before in terms of parking, and maybe what are some potential challenges with this, what we're talking about today, but what are some ways that we can all work together to create a more sustainable future that's really inclusive. So thank you guys for your audience participation because it made me rethink even what I thought coming into this discussion.
Thanks, Claire. How about Alex? Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to echo what Claire was just saying. I think that I think it's really important that we continue as a community to keep having conversations like this, because I think that, everyone's here today probably because we want to see the best city for our community and for future generations. And I think that it's a challenge to be able to it's a great challenge to find a situation that works for everyone, and to simultaneously combat on a larger scale the climate crisis and larger environmental issues of that nature. But I think that it's important that we keep trying our best as individuals and staying optimistic about this, and trying to, like Claire was saying, be the change that we want to see. But also continuing to have conversations and to engage with the whole of our community so that we can understand how we can move forward to better cities for all of us. So I think that that's an exciting note that I took from today.
Thanks, Alex. How about Bryn? Do you want to?
Yeah, definitely. I think from a technical perspective, I've definitely, thought more about incentives and what those look like in terms of what transportation methods people choose. But then also, I've really enjoyed reading everybody's comments and seeing that community engagement component. I think that's so important. I mean, we talk about it as this really emotional issue, but I think that's really cool to see. There's definitely some important stresses that need to be considered for different groups, as well as, the joys. Like I saw Brian brought up a lot of good points about, how exciting it is to live on really livable streets that are full of, restaurants and energy. So kind of balancing those, but first and foremost, making sure that community engagement is the main piece in these decision-making processes.
Thanks, Bryn. Tommy?
Great. Yeah, I think fundamentally, I think it's really important, as I've learned from the chat and my own personal opinions, that we really invest into public transit in such a way that people, all communities, right, handicapped, disabled, any low-income communities, such that they can all access public transit in such a way that they can get around without having to rely on vehicles, and specifically automobiles. I think that's been a reoccurring trend here, that essentially that parking spaces, while may not seem necessary for people who aren't disabled, it's something that's really important for those communities. And I think it's fundamental. I think it's hugely important that we invest in transit in such a way that people can ride it feeling safe, feeling secure, and being able to access it no matter their background.
Thanks, Tommy. I've learned a ton from just the chat. Has been really useful for me to think about what we know in terms of the research, in terms of especially around equity and some of the impacts that I think we're going to be continuing to study, to think about, new models that perhaps San Jose is a leader in too, because I think a lot of cities are trying to figure out how to get this right. So this is an exciting role for the city of San Jose. And from our student panelists and recent grad panelists, I love hearing your perspectives, and I, learn a lot about thinking about, what does the next generation, envision your cities to be like in the future. And I want to thank Alex and Disha for organizing this event and the sponsors. I think this is very neat to come together in these kind of casual kitchen table style conversations about these things. But I'll pass it over to Alex for some last words and wrap up.
Thanks, CJ. Appreciate it. Tisha's going to throw up a couple closing slides as we say goodbye in the last couple minutes, but we do want to keep you engaged on these issues and engaged in Catalyze SV's work. Bryn said it very well. Tonight is about community engagement, having you engaged in this discussion, us engaged with each other, and engaged with our governments on these decisions. So we want to show you a little bit more about how you can get engaged. Disha, if you can bring those slides up. I know you're working on it. We did put out an action alert about this recently, a couple of weeks ago, leading into the study session. That is the link. If you could, Disha, put it from MailChimp into the Zoom chat. If you want to reach out to your elected officials and their representatives, some of them were here tonight. You can respond to our MailChimp, and that'll allow you to weigh in on these issues. Again, the council is basically going to be voting on this in January, so we're going to stay active and engaged on these issues and letting you guys know how you can continue to do so as well. So our members had a chance to talk with city staff about this policy, and we put out a letter and position on it, so you can see that in the MailChimp list link as well if you want to check that out. So as we close out, Disha, let's go to the thank you slide. I want to thank you first, CJ, for being here and facilitating this conversation, bringing together 5 outstanding students, Mariah, Bryn, Tommy, Alex, Claire. Thank you all so much. It was great to be in community and conversation with you. We want to thank again Mineta Transportation Institute and Transform for supporting this work, helping us put on tonight's event. We also want to thank my colleague Disha for doing so much in putting it together, all the logistics and the strategy too. To our outgoing colleague Gavin Laurie for some of this research on parking that has informed our perspectives and compiled so much of the work our members have been doing. Imelda from Meta LLC, a worker-owned co-op here in San Jose that provides services like interpretation in Spanish. Muchísimas gracias, Imelda, por todo siempre. And any city staff, I know we had a few, particularly Ed, who's been working day and night on this policy. Thank you, Ed, for being here and hearing some additional community perspectives. You can chalk this up as another aspect of community engagement that the city and you have been involved in. We will be putting out this video for folks, so we'll send it to all of you in case you want to share it with family and friends, people you agree with, people you disagree with, whomever. We will follow up in the next few days and send this out to you. Thank you everyone so much for being here tonight. We ran 2 minutes over, but we really, really appreciate your time. If you want to stay engaged in our work, on the next slide, we've got some ways. These events don't happen on their own. They do take staff time. So if you want to support our work, you can donate with the link at the bottom. You can also get engaged in our 2 volunteer committees, our Community Engagement Committee, which works on events like these, both coming up with the ideas from our actual members to then planning them through to an event like tonight. We also, every month, we take a development project here in Silicon Valley, and we actually evaluate and score that project from the perspective of a member. So if you want more housing or a community room or a community garden or less parking or whatever it may be, you're welcome to become a Catalyze SV member and help us evaluate development projects. And if you just want to see what we're up to, come out on social media on the 4 channels that you're used to. We also are on YouTube if you want to watch tonight's video. And if you want to stay in touch with CJ, Alex, Mariah, Tommy, Claire, or Bryn, here's their contact information. Thank you all so much for being here. Thanks for the great comments and questions in the chat function. We will keep having conversations like this and keep sharing your ideas with us on what you'd like us to talk about going forward. I'll stick around for another couple minutes in the Zoom room in case anyone wants to chat with me. Otherwise, everyone have a wonderful night. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, CJ.
Thank you.